Okay, welcome to this week's live stream. This week we are going to be talking about analyzing a malicious PDF document that was targeting Mac users. Before we begin, I, as always, want to thank the lovely friends of Objective-C. These, again, are the sponsors, the supporters of Objective-C's free open source security tools, blogs, research, etc., etc. So quickly, Digital Security, they are my main employer. They put up with my shenanigans, as I always say, so kudos to them. Sophos, Clean My Mac X, Malwarebytes, who sent me an awesome t-shirt, SmugMug, the Guardian Mobile Firewall, and the Secure Mac. So again, mahalo, kudos to these supporters. I am forever grateful to all their support. Also want to thank my Patreons, such as Stewart, who just clapped in the chat channel. That's why I'm acknowledging him. Welcome back, Stuart. These Patreon supporters really make this financially feasible in the sense that I'm able to release all my tools free, largely open source with no strings attached. And what that means is there's no user tracking, there's no embedded ads, there's no data monetization. It's really a free, 100% free product. So again, mahalo to the Patreons and the supporters. So before we dive in and talk about the malicious PDF document, which is not super involved to analyze, I want to mention that I wrote up a blog post, and I'll post the link here in the chat, that analyzed the bug we talked about last week. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see this. That. Okay, so last week, and I'll post the video for this, my video editor was on vacation, which is cool. So I haven't posted that yet, but I will shortly. We talked about if you run vmmap against launchd, which is process 1, it would lock up a fully patched macOS Mojave system. This obviously is not a good thing, right? You shouldn't be able to completely deadlock the system from user mode, in my opinion. So what we did was, in that live stream, we walked through the bug. So I just wanted to mention that the blog for this is now live, so if you wanted to revisit that or kind of read through it, maybe that's a more appropriate way for you to ingest technical information, we kind of talk through that. So I talked, for example, about how Task Explorer used to enumerate loaded dynamic libraries, and now how it does that using vmmap, and then describe how this caused a bug. Basically, a user would report that this tool would cause a system lockup. So we talked about exactly what was going on. So check out that blog. In short, the issue was that vmmap would suspend the process and then take a memory snapshot and then resume the process, which is all well and good. But unfortunately, when it is executed with a PID1, PID1 always belongs to launchd. Launchd is kind of the main user mode process. You can really think it as the arbiter of all other user mode processes. So vmmap suspends it and then goes to take a memory snapshot, and then before it resumes it, it sends an XPC message, and I kind of explain what an XPC message is in this blog. The XPC message is handled by, you guessed it, launchd. The problem, though, is launchd has been suspended. So vmmap suspends launchd and then tries to talk to launchd. Launchd is suspended, meaning it can't handle any calls, can't, basically do anything. So vmmap waits, launchd is suspended, and eventually the entire system grounds to a halt because launchd plays a very important role in arbitering basically everything else on your system. So if it remains suspended and locked up, bad things are going to happen. So I talk through the details, look at the code within vmmap that causes this, and show exactly why this caused a full system lockup. Good news is I, of course, updated my tool, and until Apple fixes this bug, I basically just skip invoking vmmap with PID1. And the reason I'm doing this is to enumerate loaded dynamic libraries. So again, check out the blog. It's an interesting read and kind of shows some details about the vulnerabilities. It only affects Mojave, so this bug was actually introduced by Apple in the latest version of macOS. So it's a little disappointing when Apple introduces new bugs, but good job security for Patrick, right? And then finally, the last thing is I kind of made a plea to Apple and said, hey, Apple, if you're going to force us to use your utilities, for example, VMMap, please test them to ensure that if we do use them, that they don't cause the entire system to hang. So again, that's the blog. Check it out. It's just a write-up from what we talked about last time. Okay, so now let's briefly switch gears and talk about analyzing a phishing PDF document. I want to thank Charles. Post his Twitter handle here. Follow him. He does cool macOS security stuff. He brought this PDF to my attention. He said, hey, there's this PDF on VirusTotal that looks to be a phishing PDF. And we can see now Microsoft is flagging it. But at the time, no VirusTotal engines were flagging it. We can see even the majority of the other AV engines do not flag this document as malicious. So I've downloaded this PDF document because Charles mentioned it was interesting because it was targeting Mac users, which is kind of neat, specifically Apple users. So what we can do is I have a virtual machine and come on, wake up virtual machine. Cool. I've downloaded the PDF document. I'm just going to call it fish.pdf. Come on. And we can see when we open it, let me move this over here, make this a little bigger. We can see it says, dear customer, for your protection, your Apple ID is automatically locked. For additional information, click the link below. Now, this is a fairly standard phishing PDF, but before we fully discount it, it's important to understand that this is probably how a lot of Apple IDs or Mac users are being infected, or at least their Apple accounts compromised. So it's a low-tech solution, but what it basically does is it tricks people into handing over their usernames and passwords without the hacker having to really do anything. And we'll walk through kind of how this happens. And what happens when we click on this link here. Obviously, once a hacker has the Apple ID username and password, if the user does not have two-factor authentication enabled, they can log into the Apple account. And with your Apple ID, if someone compromises that, they can do a lot of bad things. I believe they can perhaps lock your iDevices, perhaps access content that you've synced. So it's really something that you don't want a hacker to be able to access. And I'll say this now, and I'll probably repeat this again. Phishing is successful. It's kind of low tech, but works. The best way to protect against this is to enable dual-factor authentication on your important accounts. And you can do this very easily with Apple ID. What dual-factor authentication is many of you likely know, it basically requires a second form of authentication when you log in from an unknown or new device. So imagine you buy a new laptop, you log into your Apple ID, Apple says, hey, I don't recognize this device, so I've texted you a message to your phone, and the assumption is that you have to have that phone in your physical, on you to then log into the device. So this is good because even if the hacker is able to get your Apple ID, for example, through a phishing attack, when they go to log into their system, they won't, in theory, be able to break the dual-factor authentication. Now, there's some tricks around it, and there's news articles every now and again saying that, dual-factor authentication, especially using SMS messages, is kind of broken, and there's some valid points there. But the reality is if you have two-factor authentication on your accounts, you're going to thwart the majority of attacks. Because basically, even if a hacker does get your username and password, they are not going to be able to access your account because they don't have access to your dual or second-factor authentication device. All right, so now we've got that spiel out of the way. Let's talk about how we can analyze this PDF to see why it's malicious and what it's kind of doing behind the scenes. Now, I do want to point out this is not necessarily specific to Mac OS. This phishing PDF document could also be sent to a Windows user, of course. And the benefit of that is hackers are able to target Apple users indiscriminate of what machine they're using, right? They might use a Windows computer at work, and the hacker might be able to email them this document. And at work, they might not be paying as much attention. They might be watching Patrick live streaming, so they might just click on the email and then be tricked into handing over their Apple ID. What this means is our analysis of the PDF document, while we're going to do this on a Mac OS system, and yes, this PDF is specifically targeting Apple IDs, so likely Apple users, this knowledge is also applicable to analyzing malicious PDF documents that are targeting Windows users, or perhaps specifically have Windows exploits. So it's kind of a cross-platform discussion that we're having today. So the first thing I do when I analyze PDFs is I use a tool from a gentleman named Didier Stevens. I'm never sure how to pronounce his name. He wrote some really cool PDF parsing utilities, and you can see this is actually posted in 2008. So he's been doing this for a while. These are free open source tools, very powerful. He's like the PDF guru. So pretty much anytime you email anything about analyzing a malicious PDF document, his name is going to pop up. I would love to meet him in person sometime, thank him for all his hard work, because his utilities have been immensely useful to me. So I've gone ahead and downloaded the PDF parser.py file. And if we hop back to his website really quick, he doesn't have a lot of information about this. So I guess let's just run it and see what it does. So let me run it without any command line arguments first. And we can see it supports a wide variety of command line options. So a PDF is obviously a document, right? That's what the D stands for. It's a portable document format. But it has kind of this proprietary format that Adobe created. So if you just like opening it in a hex editor or in a Word doc, in like something like a text edit, you really don't see much. And we can actually do this here if we cat fish.pdf, right? It's like all this kind of crap. So it's kind of like almost analyzing a binary document. You can't just read it as is. You need an analysis tool that can deconstruct the different components of it. And that's exactly what Mr. Stevens' tool does. So again, if we run it without command line arguments, we can see it has all these abilities to search, filter, dump different contents, etc., etc. We're not going to really dive too deep into this tool, but if we run this on the PDF document right here and scroll to the top, we can see that it nicely starts parsing out the format of the document. Now, there's still things that we don't understand, and we'll get to how to read these or decode them, but we can see that it breaks the PDF document into these object types. So there's object 20, there's object 30, object 20, and so these objects are kind of a core component of a PDF document. If you read the PDF spec, basically it says, okay, you have these different objects that describe different components of the PDF. And this is why you can open a PDF document on a Mac or a PC and a Windows system, and it looks essentially exactly the same. It's a very powerful document format, and the reason it's so powerful is because it describes all these components about the document. For example, how it should be laid out, what fonts it used, etc., etc. And again, it does this via these object types. So the most important things in these objects, there's always a number, and this is just a unique identifier for the object. There's a type which specifies what type of object it is. And you can read the PDF spec. We're not going to go through all the details of this, but you can see, for example, object 2 is of type catalog. This is generally near the beginning or one of the root objects. And it has things like the number of pages, and some other preferences. So it's kind of like a root. I think if we scroll to the bottom, I thought there was something that tells you, how to find that root node, but, it's usually the first one. Josh says, Didier says his name at the beginning of his videos. Awesome. So I will have to check his videos to make sure I pronounce his name. I think it's French, so maybe it's like Didier or something. Let's go with Mr. Stevens for now, because I'm probably destroying the pronunciation. Okay, so we have a PDF document, this phishing PDF document, and we have said that using the PDF parser.py utility from Mr. Stevens, we can parse and break out the components of the PDF. So if we look through, we can see there's other types of objects. There's a lot of this flaked decode, which basically means there's compressed streams. And scrolling through, we can see that there's really not a lot of information about the actual content of the document. For example, we assume that this is a phishing PDF, and if we hop back to the VM, it's likely if we click on this, this is going to take us to, for example, we can see a URL when we highlight this, gg.gg. I would like to be able to see that while we're analyzing the PDF, meaning let's see if we can figure out where that URL is stored. Much like when analyzing a piece of malware, you try to often extract the embedded command and control IP address. So yeah, if we scroll through this dump, we don't see any references to that URL. What we do see though is encrypt, and I think there's a few references to that. So it says, okay, please encrypt the metadata. Please encrypt this object 3. And yeah, so this is why we don't see, for example, the embedded URL or any other real information about this PDF, is because the hacker or the attacker has encrypted the components. Now, the only reason you do this is to protect the information in the PDF document. Now, there might be legitimate reasons why you are doing this, but in this case, the hacker obviously wants to protect metadata, but also things like the embedded URL, so that if an automated analysis system is processing this PDF, or for example, if it's uploaded to VirusTotal, the analytical engines might stumble because the sensitive or malicious information is encrypted. So lucky though, we noticed when we opened the PDF document, it didn't ask for any password. So generally, encryption is used in legitimate scenarios to password encrypt a PDF document. So if I create a sensitive PDF document and I share it with someone, I have to provide them the password so they can unlock the document, just like a password-protected Word document, password-protected zip drive, etc., etc. What the PDF spec, though, allows us to do is create encrypted PDFs with a blank key, a null key. The benefit of that is, as soon as you open the PDF document, the PDF viewer will be able to decrypt the contents because the key is a null or blank key. However, our static analysis will still fail because it's still encrypted on disk. So the two options are dynamic analysis, and I really don't know how to do dynamic analysis of a PDF. Like, I don't know how you debug a PDF document. In theory, I guess you could attach to the reader process like Preview or Adobe and then dump the memory. But since it's a encrypted PDF with a blank key, it's far easier for us just to decrypt it ourselves, right? We basically know the password. The password is null, it's blank, it's nothing. So a long time ago, I actually wrote how we would go about doing this. So before working at Digita, and even before Objective-C, I worked for a startup called Synac. Synac does crowdsourced vulnerability research, and I was their director of research. And I wrote a blog on decrypting PDF documents. So I'm going to post this blog link here, and there's two parts. I think this link is actually broken. So the second one I think is just part 2. And we'll get to that in the second one. But if you're interested in the technical details of how the encryption component works and, the PDF spec, I would recommend reading this blog. It talks about how the encryption works, reference, for example, these encrypted objects, which we saw. And then we talk about how to pull out the keys and decrypt it. In part 2, which I will open now, I actually walk through some Python code articulating how to decrypt the PDF, because since the key is blank, we know the key. Now, it uses, I believe, AES, so you have to still initialize the algorithm and basically give it a pointer to the encrypted data. So it's not trivial to do, but the point I'm trying to make is, since the key is blank, we know the password for the file, so we can programmatically decrypt it. So I have some Python code from here. What we do is we generate a blank key. We then pass that to the, we pad it because there's some padding and salting information. And then once we kind of have initialized the algorithm, again with the blank key, because the malicious document has been encrypted with a blank password key, we can decrypt it. And we can also validate that indeed it was encrypted with a blank key because we know, based on the PDF encryption and decryption algorithm, what embedded components will look like if it was encrypted with a blank key. So we can say with 100% certainty that this PDF has encrypted components and it was encrypted with a blank key, which means we can write a Python script then to decrypt that. So again, check out the details of this. It kind of goes into all the, let's say, hairy technical details of the decryption. And we show at the end, once we decrypt, in this case, this was a Windows PDF with a malicious flash file. Once we've decrypted the PDF document, we can see what's embedded in the PDF. For example, in the PDF in the blog, it's a SWF or flash file, which would exploit CVE 2010-1297. So we don't have time for all of this, and honestly, it's pretty nerdy. So we're going to cheat, and we're going to use an online service called Unlock PDF. What Unlock PDF does is it provides a way to unlock a file. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the encrypted PDF document, and we're going to upload it. I really enjoy this, this like terms of service. It's like, I pinky swear I have the right to edit this file and remove its protection. Cool. We're gonna click yes because, of course, we pinky swear. Okay, now you can open, print, and edit the PDF. Just click download. So we're gonna download this. So they're gonna come to the terminal, and we're going to cp downloads fishnunlock.pdf here. And now if we rerun the Mr. Stevens PDF parser on the unlocked PDF, hopefully we have a lot more information. Cool. So first we can see everything's been expanded because part of the analysis that this service does, and I'll post the link to this decryption service online. I don't know anything about this company. I'm not recommending that or endorsing them. I'm just saying this worked. It decrypted this. And yeah, they have some more information about this. It says files with an owner password can be unlocked instantly. However, if the file is thoroughly encrypted, you can only unlock a file by providing the correct password. Malware, though, is not going to do that because, if you send someone a malicious PDF document, unless you also send them the password in the email, that's just too complicated. So we can normally unlock malicious PDFs directly because the key is blank. Awesome. So let's hop back and see what is inside the now decrypted PDF document. So we can see things like references to images. This is probably the UI of the PDF document. Font information, really not too interested in that. I'm just going to start scrolling through, and I'm just kind of skimming this, looking for interesting stuff. Again, a lot of font information. This isn't malicious per se. This is just, how you build a PDF document. So let's see. Okay, cool. Here we have something really interesting. We have object 49. We see type action. Action, I'm assuming, means something happens, right? And we can see that when this action occurs, what it's going to do, it's going to open a URI, which is just a kind of fancy name for a URL, to http://gg.authentaccountserve. So let's remember this URL because, as we'll see, it's important to the next step of this phishing attack. Looks like there's another reference to this action as well. We see another annotation type. And this is an example where an object, in this case object 51, references object 52. If we hop to object 52, we can see that it is the action object. So this shows how the PDF document is constructed by these objects, and objects can reference other objects. So this is an annotation that references the action URL clicky thing, right? So again, other types of actions, some other URLs, probably some duplicate type stuff, blah, 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 blah. I don't know what all the rest of this is. This is probably just stuff for laying out the PDF, nothing that's specific to anything being malicious. There's other actions showing other URLs. So, if we were doing a full analysis or report of this PDF document, we would obviously want to extract these URLs and, provide them as indications of compromise or, this ongoing phishing attack. There are some other URLs as well. Again, they all kind of look to kind of phishing related, right? Like your account has been locked.com. So it's likely what happens is when the user clicks on the button in the PDF document, it might take them to a page where one of these URLs that asks them for their Apple ID. Now, the last thing I want to mention in this document is if we scroll all the way to the end, we can see that the metadata has been decrypted. So there's some interesting metadata here. We can see the author is apparently Bakril Ilni. This can obviously be spoofed, but there might be some interesting information. Looks like it's also been created with Sija 3267. We have a modification date, so we can see 2019. I guess this is February 26th. So, wait, that's tomorrow. Oh my goodness, we have a PDF from the future. Again, these things can all be spoofed, but it's likely that this was, this is probably because I just modified it by unlocking it. So this might be different. However, this metadata, we should validate if the website itself generated this, but I'm doubtful of that. It might have set the modification date, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't, set a creator flag, and definitely should not create an author flag. But again, it's always good to take metadata and authoring information with a grain of salt because it can be obviously modified, or if you're using a decryption program, it may update the metadata itself. And this is one of the reasons I like to often write my own tools. For example, in the Synac blog, we showed how to do that because then complete control over exactly the whether your tool is going to do that. So I think that is about all I wanted to discuss for the static analysis of this. Okay, and here's the trailer I was talking about. This has some information about that. And for example, I believe it says the root object is object 1.0. So let's see if we can find object 1, 0. That's 10, 11, 12, 14. Where? This is gonna get annoying really fast. Oh my goodness. Maybe there. Okay, cool. Yeah. So object 1 again is that catalog object that we saw earlier, and this is how a PDF reader like Adobe or Preview works. What it does is it goes to the end of the PDF document, looks for the trailer, and then goes into the trailer and looks for the root key and says, what is the first object? And as we showed, this object 1.0 is the catalog, which makes sense. This is like the main object for the PDF document that describes the rest of the PDF document. All right, so to wrap up the discussion about the static analysis of this PDF document, we showed that it was encrypted. We used the online decryptor program, though we could have done it ourselves in Python because the key is a blank key, but that's a lot of work. The online one is way easier. And then once the PDF has been decrypted, static analysis provides a decent amount of information. We can see all the components about the PDF, and we extracted some important URLs. For example, gg.gg. That's kind of a cool URL. So now let's hop over to the VM and do some static analysis. Basically what we're going to do is we're just going to click on this URL and see what it goes. First thing I want to do is let's look up that gg.gg URL. And so we get an IP address. What we're going to do is we're going to hop over to Wireshark. If you're not familiar with Wireshark, Wireshark is a program that allows you to sniff network traffic. So it's really cool because you can see all network going-ons on your system. I use it a lot mostly for analyzing malware. So I'll have the malware running in a virtual machine. I will get the IP address of the virtual machine and then put that as a filter into Wireshark. Because otherwise, if you sniff all your network traffic, it's going to just be overwhelming, right? You're going to see like your Pandora streaming, your Gmail client checking in, chat program, if you're streaming on Twitch, all that data, it's going to be very difficult. So it's very important to have a good filter. So in this case, we're going to set an IP filter for this IP address. And you can do that via ip.adder == and then the IP address you want to filter on. The IP address we specified, 91.224.140.71, is the IP address of gg.gg, which is, remember, an embedded URL that we saw in the decrypted PDF document. And actually, if we mouse over this, we can see that there's an annotation pop-up saying where this would going. This is, again, kind of a, I would say, misstep on the hacker's point of view. Like, I'm pretty sure you can control what this annotation pop-up shows. So, like, I would, like, have it say it goes to, like, apple.com. Like, I don't necessarily know if you have to be honest about where it's going to go. Or at least set it to something blank, or at least don't put an annotation. Because if I mouse over this, if I'm a user, like, okay, I should go and resolve this, and I see that it's like gg.gg, like, that's already one big red flag. So we have Wireshark running, or we will shortly. And it's basically filtering on this IP address, the 99.224. Someone said, live Wireshark traffic analysis is making my eyes twitch. Yes, it is. I would not recommend it. So it's just, for me, it's like stressful. But I like it when you have a good filter because you can passively see exactly what's going on. So we're now going to hop to the VM and we're going to click on the go to resolution center. So we're pretending we're this naive user who's got this PDF document. Perhaps we think it's from like our sysadmin, or maybe it's from, we think it's from Apple. So if we click on that, we notice it's going to launch Safari, and we can see Safari is going to GG, but then it changes to some other website. Now, Safari is rather helpful because it says this connection is not private, which is good. And it says this website might be impersonating something else. We're going to try to go to this website, so I'm going to just click like allow, and then you have to basically manually approve that. Safari now knows this is a phishing website. I'm guessing since this phishing attack has been going on for a while, that Google Safe Browsing has detected that. They're usually pretty good at picking up on that. And they will pop up a big warning to the user. So hopefully, even if the user was tricked into clicking on that, they will not continue once they get this big warning basically telling them that, hey, user, you are literally about to be phished. So this is Safari, or I believe Chrome does something similar, basically previously understanding that this is a phishing website and attempting to warn the users, which is, again, a good thing. We're going to click Show Details and click Visit this this unsafe website. And unfortunately, we get a 404, meaning the page is not found. My guess is this phishing attack is now done. What hackers will normally do is send out a malicious PDF or email, stand up some custom phishing URLs, and then after a few days, once Google and Safari and the rest of the world has, caught on to this attack, just shut down the servers and rinse and repeat all over again, right? If Safari is warning users about this, it's very, very unlikely that users are actually going to go through and click through this. So let's hop over to Wireshark, and if we're lucky, which we are, we've seen that there are some, it has detected some activity going to this IP address. So what we can do is we can click on this GET request, and if you right-click and click Follow TCP stream, this will nicely illustrate the PDF stream. Oh, come on. It's thinking. Okay, there it is. Is this big enough? Yeah, cool. So we can see there's a GET request to gg.gg, and it's trying to request the auth account serve, which if we go back to the decrypted PDFs, this is the action that was embedded within the PDF document. So we assumed when we clicked this button, it was going to trigger this action and try to go to this URL. We've now just confirmed that via dynamic analysis. So we can see this get request, and we can see that the server responds with a 301 permanently moved, and it says it has been moved to this validate verify account serve.com.mailycongogo.com, blah, blah, blah. So a 301 basically says, okay, I got your request, but I've changed where this resource is, and provides a new URL. So that's why in Safari we first saw, if we look closely, and actually let's try this again. So watch very closely. We will first see Safari try to go to, oh, come on, does this not work? gg.com, and then very quickly it gets redirected to this validate verify account server. This is because, as I just mentioned, the gg.com returns a 301 permanently moved. I wonder if we can do this manually. I think if you do like a, no, 80, this is probably not going to work. If you do like get, cool. There's probably a 301. Oh, let me move this over here. Redirect. Is there? No, I don't know. But there is some interesting stuff on this page in the gg.com. So what I would probably do if I was analyzing this, I would go and look into that more. Maybe it's just a URL shortener. So maybe they have a custom URL shortener. Who knows? End result, though, is that because of the 301, it gets redirected to this valid verify account server. My guess would be that when this site was active, oh, that's funny. Apple has a issue in their rendering where the buttons are white. So you can't see what they should be. Oh, Apple, we love you. That's funny. Okay, we're back. Dark mode is working. So normally, again, the user would hopefully at this point not continue. And it's actually very difficult. You have to click show details and then visit this unsafe website. But this only occurs after Apple or Google has identified this as a malicious phishing website. So it's likely that when the hacker sent out this phishing attack, this URL was not flagged. So likely when the user clicked on that link, it would go to a web page that looked exactly like Apple. Again, it's a standard phishing practice, and basically said, hey, please enter your old Apple ID and password and then a new one. And the users, some users would fall for that, put in their username and password, again, thinking that this was Apple's real website and that because of this PDF, they had to reset their Apple ID, right? These are all lies. None of this is true. People fall for this. And then once they entered their username and password into the website, if the phishing attack was smart, it would redirect it to Apple and perhaps really reset the Apple ID so that the user would not be aware that anything suspicious had just occurred. But obviously in the background, squirrel away a copy of their Apple account information. And then armed with that, they could perhaps do things like apply for a developer certificate or access sensitive information about the user. You know, the whole celebrity scandal that happened a few years ago where intimate photos of celebrities were accessed and leaked largely happened because the attackers were able to gain access to the iCloud accounts of these celebrities, and they had synced these intimate photos to iCloud. So if you have someone's Apple ID, you can perhaps log into their iCloud account and see what information is synced there, which may be photos, chats, all sorts of things that you obviously don't want hackers to analyze. So that kind of wraps up the analysis of this PDF document. It's a phishing attack. It's not super sophisticated, but it is very successful and is largely how organizations and users often fall prey to malware. One of my favorite quotes is, "There's no patch for human stupidity." And this kind of means that you can have the most secure up-to-date Mac, but if some user in your organization falls for one of these attacks and puts in their corporate credentials or their Apple ID, this may give hackers access into the network. And so there's really no risk to the hackers here. They can send out this phishing document or email to everyone in a corporation or millions of users, And if a few fall for this, this might be all they need. So it's important not to underestimate the power of phishing, even though it's a very low-tech solution. Right? It requires user interactions, as we've shown. So this was kind of interesting because this was the first phishing document I've seen targeting Apple IDs. I'm sure this happens commonly. This is the first one I've just seen. But it was kind of a good case study to describe how to analyze a malicious PDF. Just to reiterate for some of the people who are joining the chat, the first thing we did was we analyzed it with some PDF parsing documents. And then, since it was encrypted, we used an online decryptor to decrypt the PDF document. We then reanalyzed that, found some embedded URLs, and then when we executed the PDF document in a virtual machine, we confirmed that these URLs are the phishing servers that the user would be directed to. So that is a wrap for today. Again, this ability to analyze malicious PDF documents is platform agnostic, right? You can use these same techniques to analyze PDFs that are targeting Windows users or PDFs that are targeting Mac users. And this is because PDF documents are platform agnostic. You can open a PDF document, obviously, on Windows and Mac, and it should look the same. So a lot of hackers use PDF documents to distribute malware. In the past, there have been a lot of vulnerabilities in PDF viewers, for example, Adobe. So PDFs are kind of a somewhat unsafe file document type. And of course, as we saw today, they can also be used just in the phishing schemes, right? Like the attacker could obviously have sent the same information in an email, but perhaps the PDF looks more official, or perhaps the fact that this content can be encrypted and then automatically decrypted by the PDF viewer. This is a way to bypass perhaps phishing detecting software, right? There might be something that's scanning incoming mail, and perhaps it's unable to decrypt PDF documents on the fly, so it doesn't detect this phishing attack. So this is probably why the attacker is using a PDF document to pull off the phishing attack. So that's all I had for today. We, as always, have some time for some Q&A. So Maria says, please upload the previous video on YouTube related to exe file running on Mac. I will do that. I have a recording of that. My video editor is, or was on vacation. I just saw on his Instagram that he's back on island, so I'm going to be hitting him up and begging him to edit the video. And as soon as it's been edited, I will upload it to YouTube. Let's bring up the YouTube channel just really quick because we can. And I'll post that here. So generally I'm quicker. This week I'm not, so forgive me. But all these live streams are eventually posted to the YouTube channel. So if you missed anything or kind of jumped in late or want to catch up on some of them, feel free to watch those. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel or this Twitch channel to get notifications of that. So, are there any questions about anything? Yes, and GamerBot, my amazing mod, again, shout out to the Patreon page. This is how I support this kind of research and all the tools. So, I personally believe that security tools for end users should be free. And so obviously that takes a lot of time to write free tools. One of the ways I'm able to do that is through Patreon support. So I know some of the people in the channel right now are current Patreon supporters, so thank you. I'm forever indebted to you. At least check out the page if you're not, and if you like what I do, consider supporting, even for $1. Josh says, update on Objective by the Sea 2.0. I'm very, very excited because it's very, very close to being updated. We have dates, we have a venue. I am simply waiting on the hotel to send me the link for booking the hotel room block. And this is because I don't want to announce it and then people get all excited, but then they can't book the venue. So Hopefully, I know it's been a while, but I'm expecting to get the link from that from the hotel in these next few days. I will be at RSA next week, so I might announce it then, if not, definitely before. But good news, it's definitely happening. We already have some talk submissions from some really awesome speakers. If you are interested in Mac security research, we will have a call for papers, and I would love if any and all of you would submit talks. The topics are surrounded or focused on Mac security and also iOS security, and cover things generally like we talk about in this live stream. Malware, exploits, vulnerabilities, tools, etc., etc. Now, it might be a little nerve-wracking to perhaps talk at a conference, or you might say, wow, Patrick, you know a lot about this. I'm not sure if, I can submit a talk to the conference because I haven't been doing this as long as you. That's fine, still submit a talk. Like, I gave a lot of talks at smaller conferences before I knew as much as I did today. So, submit, and we'll see where it goes. I will be posting information about how to submit to the conference shortly when we announce it. So, to again briefly answer that question, Josh, Objective by the Sea 2.0, which is our Objective-C's Mac security conferences, is happening. It's going to happen at the end of spring, and it's going to be in Southern Europe at somewhere super dope. I'm really, really excited about that. So stay tuned, and I appreciate your patience. Difficult dealing with a hotel in 12-hour time zone because they email me something, I email them, and it takes a day for us to respond. But we're basically waiting for the last thing. Okay, another question. Which virtual machine vendor are you using for your macOS guest? VMware, Parallels, Oracle, and others. This is a great question. What a virtual machine allows one to do, in case you're not all fully aware of that, is basically run an instance of, for example, Mac OS in an isolated environment. So this VM, for example, cannot talk to my developer box. So I can run a piece of malware, and that piece of malware can do whatever it wants to this VM. It can delete the OS files, it can persist, it can install, but it can't access my developer box, my personal files, right? So it's good. It's kind of like a sandbox, and it's a container. So using a VM for any malware analysis is highly recommended, because if you mess something up. You can also do something called snapshots, which means you can basically take a snapshot, a instance of the VM, run some malware, and then just revert to kind of restore and get back to state one. Josh had a good point. Says, unless you encounter some nasty sandbox escaping malware. So there have been instances of exploits that break out of a virtual machine that can, for example, detect that they're running in a virtual machine and then try to escape. This can happen, but it's incredibly rare, incredibly sophisticated. But again, it's good to be aware of this. So that's generally why I do static analysis on malware first, to kind of get a sense of it. If it's something incredibly sophisticated, I might actually analyze it on native hardware. But if it's, adware or pretty much any Mac malware that we've seen, it's unlikely to have a virtual machine escape. To answer the question, which one I use VMware, and this is because it just works great on Mac OS. Another one is Parallels. I think it works equally well. VMware just, it's kind of like the de facto standard. So I don't have any huge attachment to it per se, but it seems to work really well decently well for Mac OS, and they continually update. Problem is, it's rather expensive, but hopefully if you're doing malware analysis for a company or even maybe at the university, you can get a discount of it. But it's definitely a invaluable tool. So I use, again, VMware Fusion, and it's always good to update to the latest version because they do patch security issues, and they're continually improving the compatibility with Mac OS. The other thing I want to mention about virtual machines is that some malware will actually detect if it's running in a VM. And the reason it does this is basically the only reason Mac or any malware is going to encounter a virtual machine is because it is being analyzed by a security researcher such as myself. I mean, there might be like 1 or 2% of the population that like runs a virtual machine like as part of work. Maybe that's 5%, 10%. And you know, that's really their system. But malware authors basically say, look, if I detect I'm running in a virtual machine, I'm going to exit, I'm going to self-delete because, you know, I'm basically going to assume that someone's poking on me, and I really don't want that to happen. So if you're ever analyzing a piece of malware that's not running in a VM, it's likely that it has some VMware detection logic, because it's pretty easy for malware or any code to detect if it's running in a VM. So if you Google that, there's some easy ways. For example, we talked in a previous talk. One way you can do that is grep-i VMware. So you can see like malware could run this command, and you can see there's a lot of VMware related files because, again, I'm executing this command in a VM because this is a VM. So VMware doesn't like try to hide the fact that, you know, it's virtualizing something. So there's a lot of ways for malware to very easily detect that it's running in a virtual machine. And normally, again, what it does is once it detects that, it exits or doesn't execute. Now, if malware authors were a little more creative, what they would do is they would have like the core payload and then like a fake payload, I would argue. And then both those would be encrypted. And they would be encrypted with an environmental key, which would basically be something related to VMware or not VMware. And that's actually really cool. I'm going to go off on a tangent, but this is like awesome. You can have one encrypted payload that decrypts with 2 different keys to 2 different valid plain texts. So you could encrypt the text, I love you, I hate you. You could encrypt them with 2 different keys. It would then look like one encrypted block. And if you encrypted that block with one key, it would spit out, I love you. If you encrypted the block with another key, it would spit out, I hate you. So this is an incredibly powerful encryption technique. It's actually a really good idea if you're perhaps, you know, have something encrypted on your machine. If that machine ever gets captured, let's say, and someone wants to force you to decrypt that content, well, if you've used this kind of dual encryption scheme, you could provide the fake or secondary key, and it would decrypt to something innocuous. Now, where this all goes is what I think malware authors should do, and this is kind of an evil idea, is to have 2 payloads, one that's like the real malicious payload, and one is like the fake, I'm running in a VM payload, encrypt it, and then the 2 keys be, you know, I'm running in VM or I'm not running in VM. If it detects it's running in VM, it can just decrypt and execute the fake VM payload. Now, this isn't foolproof, but for the vast majority of people who are analyzing this malware, especially dynamically, they will see an encrypted blob, they will see the encrypted blob execute or decrypt and execute, and they will assume that that is the payload of the malware. Right? When in reality, if you actually ran that on a native system, not in a virtualized environment, it would do something completely different, something way more, you know, sensitive or evil. So it's kind of lame when we see current Mac malware authors just bail if they detect they're running in a VM. They could do something a lot stealthier and a lot more interesting. All right, end tangent. If you're a malware author, maybe don't do that. Okay, other questions. Do you recall the bad BIOS claims years ago? Was that ever proven to be an attack vector on Mac OS? So bad BIOS was very interesting, and I'll caveat I don't know a lot about that, but my understanding is a well-respected security researcher seemed to believe their system was infected. And I might be mixing this up because there's also some BIOS-related research that aim to infect Macs, or any system rather, at the BIOS level. And the reason you want to infect the BIOS level is because it sits below the operating system. So it basically doesn't matter if you're running Mac OS or Windows, or even if you reinstall the operating system, because the infection at the BIOS level sits outside the operating system. So this is an incredible persistence technique Because normally, if you think you're infected, and I tell people this all the time, reinstall Mac OS and that will wipe anything. And that's true unless the malware is existing outside the operating system, meaning in the BIOS. So the question, was this ever proven to be an attack vector on Mac OS? I don't have the answer for that, but what I can tell you, on recent versions of Mac, they've switched to, instead of using BIOS, to using something called EFI, which stands for Extensible Firmware Interface. UEFI stands for Universal Extensible Firmware Interface. And basically, that is kind of BIOS updated. It's like a new system. It performs similar benefits, but one of the things that it has is the ability to, I believe, verify itself, especially if the MacBook, which I believe the newer MacBooks have, is this T2 chip. And my understanding is it allows them to do something called secure boot, which basically can verify that the BIOS or the EFI firmware has not been modified. So I'm not sure if these BIOS attacks were successful against Macs. I know there in the past have been some EFI vulnerabilities and exploits that could be used to infect Mac computers, but recent versions of Mac hardware with these T2 chips really raised the bar because now they can basically verify, at least in theory, and in my understanding it's very implemented very well, and detect any such attacks. So yes, the follow-up question, is there a SHA-256 or checksum on Mac OS firmware to confirm that what is installed on Mac OS hardware was released by Apple? And is there a low-level API from Apple to conduct firmware checksum analysis? These are great questions. There was a talk, I believe, and let me see if I can pull this up, that the guy who now works at Apple researched. Let me just see if I can find the link for this. Yes. So I'm not an expert on this low-level EFI type related research, but Pupine, who, as I mentioned, was recently hired by Apple, I believe because this research he did was so incredible, kind of digs all into that. And he talks about what EFI is, how they, here, let me pull this over here so we can talk through this. You know, what they analyzed, what they found, and they talked some of the problems that, you know, you can't very easily validate the EFI. Because, you know, the question is, how do you validate the EFI? Okay, do you run a command? Well, if you run a command, if the EFI is infected, it's going to lie and say it's not infected, right? So pretty much what you kind of have to do is dump the firmware, like, which requires some crazy hardware hacks, like I don't even know how to do it, and then basically offline hash it and validate that it hasn't been tampered with. But I don't think Apple releases any information about that. And part of Pupine's research was that Apple doesn't even do a good job releasing information about the updated versions of their firmware, and even worse, what they found was a Mac could say that it was updated, but it was actually running an old version of EFI, something that had not been patched or fixed. So Apple basically didn't really do that good a job. I believe they are now doing a lot better job, and the fact that Pupine now works for them, he's probably, you know, he's an amazing researcher. I'm sure one of the reasons he was hired was to basically help Apple fix that. So I would recommend checking out this write-up. He also gave a talk, I think, at Black Hat London, and he mentioned at Echo Party, which is one of my favorite conferences. Echo Party in Argentina. Yeah, dope. This was last year's. If you can go, check it out. And so yeah, that should answer, yeah, so hopefully that gives you more insight into all the EFI stuff. And again, on caveat, I'm not an expert, but some of that research from Pupine when he worked at Duo is spot on. Very important research because, as I mentioned, if you can muck with EFI, it's almost like you can live outside Mac OS. I mean, it is outside Mac OS. So this is what advanced nation states are theoretically doing, right? Adware isn't going to muck with EFI. Even the average cyber criminal is not going to muck with the EFI because you have to have sophisticated exploits and understanding and custom firmware. But nation states are likely very interested in that because if they can infect your Mac once, it's pretty much going to be infected forever, regardless if you wipe or reinstall Mac OS. I mean, if the EFI is modified, it's like, one that's incredibly hard to detect. There's no like easy way to detect that. And even if you could detect it, it's pretty much very difficult to reinstall. I think you might be able to boot into like the internet recovery mode, but again, even that itself is EFI, which if we assume is infected, you can't trust. So EFI, very, very important, not very understood. But now Apple, I believe, is doing a lot better of a job with their T2 chips, and they're doing a lot more validation, I believe, of the firmware. Yes, awesome question. Any others? Let me just see if I missed any of these. Cool. Any other questions? So as I mentioned, next week I will be at RSA. I am giving a talk about things. Oh, come on. Where are we? RSA, my speaker notes. Talking about some of the stuff we've been doing at Digita. But it's kind of neat talking about some Mac malware, some really cool detection capabilities. So yes, if you had RSA, Josh, awesome, you'll be there. I met with Josh last year, I think maybe every year. Send me a DM, hopefully come to my talk. I'll be around for the week. I'm also giving some guest lectures at Stanford and UC Santa Cruz. So I'm going to try to live stream next Tuesday, but no promises because I might be like stuck in a meeting or something. Maybe I can like live stream from my hotel room. At that time, hopefully we'll have more detail, all the details about Objective-C. So maybe we can, even if we're not live streaming about, analyzing some malware, we can discuss about Objective-by-the-C 2.0. So stay tuned for that. Again, mahalo so much for awesome. Stumpy Ahoy says, appreciate using the Magic Trackpad. Love you using it. Convinced me to give it a try, and I love it. Yeah, I actually had the old one, and the old one was super annoying because it just was dying, and so it would lose connections. So trackpad. So I went with a new one, even though it's kind of pricey. But so far I'm loving it. And, I've used mice, but I just love the trackpad. So I'm a big fan. And it works really well, obviously, with Mac OS. So I'm glad it was that was inspiring. Let me know if you like it when you get it. And I'll feel bad. I'll feel bad if you spend $90 or whatever, and then you're like, man, this thing sucks. Maybe I can get Apple to give me a discount on the next one because I can be like, hey, people who watch my live stream are now buying more of the Magic Trackpads. All right, so again, mahalo to, first and foremost, all the Patreon supporters. Honestly, couldn't do it without y'all. And then also, just again, thanks to all the companies that support my research. These are great Mac security companies, so check out the page. And, oh, okay, cool. So you already got the Magic Trackpad. Okay, awesome. So Stumpy Ahoy says he got the Magic Trackpad, and he loves it. So I'm glad that that was a good investment. Yeah, I'm really stoked. And also the Apple keyboard is great. I have a MacBook, but what I do is I just put it in clamshell mode and then connect it to two external monitors. Because, yeah, I mean, I don't get the Retina display, unfortunately, but the two external monitors are great. If you're doing malware analysis, it's kind of a must, because what I normally do is I have my disassembler, Hopper or IDA Pro, and then I have the VM where I'm usually in tandem stepping through the malware dynamically. And so it's kind of a great way to do that. So actually, when I worked for the government at the NSA, I had a 4-monitor setup, which was awesome. So I had 1 monitor, 2 monitor, 3 monitor, 4 monitor. And it was way too much monitor space, but I felt super cool. So I could have email and chat on 1 monitor, and then the cool hacker stuff I was working on maybe 1 or 2 monitors. And then unfortunately it was a completely air-gapped network. I don't know if I can talk about all these details, but I'll keep it vague. Which means it wasn't connected to the internet because obviously, like, the NSA doesn't want to get hacked, so they make sure that their internal classified network is the term is air gapped, which means it's not connected to the internet. So you couldn't like stream music and you couldn't like browse Reddit or Twitter. So I think I was actually a lot more productive because I wasn't distracted by like checking Instagram and whatever. So but I always I always remembered that like sometimes I would have to bring files from the internet in for work, and it was just I remember like printing out source code and then like coming back to my system and like typing it up, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's got to be a more efficient way to do this. So, but again, if you want to secure a system, you can't have it connected to the internet because at some point you will get hacked. Awesome. Cool. Well, I think that's a wrap. See you hopefully next Tuesday.